Welcome to the Ladder Project Speaker Series. You are listening to a recording from our first speaker, Professor Ben Thirkell-White from Victoria University. We hope you enjoy.
A mainstream economist view, and perhaps traditional in the sense of in the 1960s, 1970s view of development. And the starting point for that kind of thinking tends to be that poverty is lack of income. People are poor because somehow or other they're not in a position to earn a lot. And certainly in the 80s, the IMF and World Bank felt that the solution to that was to promote growth by doing free market things. These days they've moved away from that a little bit. The bank now talks, I think, much more seriously about pro-poor growth, although the bank is always a controversial institution because it has many things going on. But the idea is that if you get an economy going, there'll be higher prices for things, there'll be lots of opportunities for people to get jobs, and the poor will kind of, around the edges of that, hopefully manage to tag along. Second approach, which I've described as the UNDP approach for want of a better label, they overlap. At the kind of more social policy end of the bank, there's not that much difference between them. And in a way, that's different from saying income, and assuming that if you have money, you can buy what you need, to moving towards needs, but generally fairly kind of concrete material needs, I would say. The UNDP is in charge of the Millennium Development Goals, some of you might have heard about, and they concentrate on things. I mean, there's a general goal to reduce absolute poverty without much specificity about what they're going to do, but there are also things about things like infant mortality, life expectancy, concrete stuff like this, doctors, mosquito nets, and kind of measures of poverty. They're a little bit more closer to what people actually need to go about their everyday lives, perhaps, than the income view is. And then kind of moving a little bit further along, I'll just describe it as an NGO perspective. That would argue perhaps that poverty is primarily about powerlessness. Some people would say that poverty should be seen as powerlessness. I think I wouldn't go that far, I'll explain later. And then that tends to be a focus much more on local level projects to help communities to acquire the kind of power they need to make their lives easier. Okay, so that's my kind of three guiding things. Lady said that she'd come across lots of kind of confusingness about absolute poverty and relative poverty and simple poverty and complex poverty. So just a few things that you'll find in the press, in the policy kind of literature. Generally, when people talk about poverty and poverty measurement, they start off with income measures. Two reasons. One is this idea that you can buy what you need if you've got money, which there may be problems with, but anyway. And secondly, it's just an easy measure. If people want to find numbers about stuff so that they can allocate stuff, they need a number they can use. They use income. It's not perfect. For what it's worth, the World Bank talks about absolute poverty as people who are living on less than $2 a day, and extreme poverty as people who are living on less than $1 a day. And I should have looked up the numbers, but that's an enormous number of people, millions and millions of people in the world. It's not a brilliant measure. The bank likes it because it enables them to compare different countries really easily. But most people would say that it's more useful to look at individual countries' poverty lines. A couple of reasons for that. Basically, that as I said on there, $2 slightly more in some places than it does in others. And secondly, in moving away from such a kind of material view of poverty, what a necessity of life is somewhat variable across countries. It tends to be partly about what society expects you to have. That's probably on my next slide from what I remember. Yes. A nice quote from Adam Smith, him of the 18th century, has a reputation for being free market, talks about the ability to appear in public without shame as a measure of poverty, which is quite nice, I think, because it captures this social aspect. That poverty isn't just about not having money to buy stuff, it's also often tied up with disrespect, with poor treatment, with being invisible, and with embarrassment, I guess, in all sorts of public situations. Which isn't to undermine the material stuff. You need food on the table. But it's to point out that poverty is often about more than that. And certainly its effects. Back to the Oxford English Dictionary, after it talks about poverty as a lack of necessities of life, it went on to define it as inferiority and meanness. Not things I'd want to say about the poor, but often the way that poor are judged in practice. And that moves on to the suggestion that it may be useful to think of poverty in relative terms, certainly in terms of self-esteem, in terms of how we feel about ourselves, in terms of how we fit into the community. It may be that it's relative measures that matter, and it's worth pointing out that there's poverty in museums, and that there are people who can't afford the right clothes to appear okay in public and not look like a weirdo, etc. Even though those people mostly have way more income than would be consistent with the world. Okay, so just back to a little recap. There's the kind of UNDP point is that just thinking about growth and just thinking about income doesn't necessarily track outcomes, doesn't necessarily translate into what life is actually like for the poor. But even the UNDP approach, which is kind of critique of the bank model, if you like, is still a little bit measurement focused. The poor are objects to be classified, put in tables and compared. And there's a role for that, because if there's limited resources, it will continue to think about where to spend them. But it's dangerous, I think. And the kind of more empowerment approaches are about trying to start with poor people, to understand their lives, what the difficulties might be, and start to get a handle on both what the necessities of life might actually be in various places, which is kind of an interesting question, and also about where poverty comes from. And a lot of the debate in the academic literature is about measurements, and I think that's a bit of a problem, because you do need to measure, but then you need to get past measuring and start to understand where poverty comes from and deal with it. And that's why some people, as I said before, argue that poverty is powerlessness, and we should incorporate an idea of powerlessness when we hear that word. I have a little bit of a problem with that, because I think it's maybe more helpful to think of, let's forward a bit, powerlessness is the thing that creates poverty analytically, at least. We probably have those together. But I think we think of poverty as a material lack, and I think it's sort of perhaps easy to understand that poverty is a material lack, powerlessness is something that leads to that material lack, and its consequences. I think I don't need to recap yet again, so we'll get that. Okay, so we've got at least some idea. Poverty is income, poverty is stuff that isn't happening in people's lives, poverty is a more kind of social condition of not being able to do stuff, the lack of power in some way. Going to move on from that to just talk at least as quickly as I can about causes of poverty. They're, in a sense, powerlessness is multidimensional and pervasive, and I could easily spend many, many hours just listing the different kinds of difficulties that occur to some people. It's kind of a humbling experience just to think through all the stuff that's just easy for us and difficult for other people, mainly through an accident at birth. But the reason people like that measurement is because measurement sort of leads you to thinking about different kinds of ways of dealing with stuff, and I'm going to talk through some of those quite quickly. From an income point of view, I don't think anybody really sees the solution to poverty as handing out cash anymore, except in the very short term, in disaster recovery. My give a man a fish thing is that one problem of give a man a fish and he eats for a day, and you teach him to fish and he lives forever, or for as long as his natural lifespan. And I think most people accept that now. The question is more whether you sit in a World Bank, IMF economist kind of perspective, which says, in the end, the long-term solution to poverty is to produce growth, or whether you feel that that's A, actually has proved more difficult to achieve than economists thought it would be, and B, what happens to the poor in the meantime. Even economists will accept that the prospect of kind of turning Indonesia into somewhere with a similar economy to New Zealand is still a 30-year project. In the meantime, what will the poor do for 30 years, even if it happens, or if it's desirable. So that leads you to this kind of UNDP kind of Human Development Index kind of approach, and that leads to questions primarily about government services, about government-funded healthcare, about government-funded infrastructure, about improving government services so they do actually meet the needs of the poor, that kind of thing. And then the NGO perspective, I suspect, is possibly closer to the kind of things you guys are leaning towards, and that tends to look more at now and less at long-term, I would argue. Although the outcomes can be long-term.